The Invisible Woman, a story of loneliness, temptation, and the courage to choose. The most dangerous moment in a marriage is not the fight. It is the silence after the fighting stops, when two people learn to live beside each other without ever truly meeting. Part 1. The Woman No One Sees. I want to tell you something I have never said out loud. Not to my sister, not to my therapist. The one I stopped seeing 3 years ago, because the session started feeling like maintenance rather than healing. Not to my closest friend, who would listen and understand, and then, in some careful way, judge me for it, because that is what we do to each other when we love each other and are frightened by what we recognize. Not to my husband, for reasons that will become clear. I want to tell you, because you are the only person I can tell it to without consequence. Because you are reading this from a distance that makes honesty possible. And because I suspect, if you have lived long enough inside a life that looked correct from the outside, you will understand something of what I am about to describe. My name is Anna Hartley. I am 41 years old. I live in a craftsman house in Ashford, Vermont. A town that is beautiful in exactly the way that small New England towns are beautiful, which is to say, completely and without apology. All maple trees and white churches and the particular quality of light in October that makes everything look like a painting of itself. I have a husband named Daniel. I have 2 children, Cora, who is 14, and Owen, who is 10. I have a garden that produces more zucchini than any family can reasonably consume. A book club I attend every 3rd Thursday, and a job I do from the house grant, writing for non-profits work that is meaningful in the abstract and invisible in the particular. From the outside, this life looks like enough. From the inside, for a very long time, it felt like a room I had been locked in so gently that I had not noticed the door closing. I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because precision matters when you are trying to describe something that is easy to misunderstand, something that lives in the space between what is objectively fine and what is quietly devastating. My marriage to Daniel was not abusive. It was not cruel. There were no affairs that I knew of, no gambling debts, no drinking problems, no dramatic failures of character. Daniel was a good man who worked hard and came home and sat in his chair and was present in the way that a piece of furniture is present, occupying space without filling it. We did not fight. We had stopped fighting years ago, which I had mistaken for peace for a long time, before I understood that what we had was not peace, but exhaustion. We had fought once about everything about money and parenting decisions, and who forgot to call the insurance company, and why he always left the cabinet doors open, and why she never seemed to want to be touched anymore. And then, somewhere in the middle years of our marriage, we had stopped. Not because we had resolved anything, because we had both, without discussing it, decided that the effort of conflict was more than the relationship seemed worth. That is the thing no one tells you about a marriage that is dying quietly. It does not feel like dying. It feels like growing up, like maturity, like 2 people who have moved past the dramatic nonsense of early love and arrived at the dignified plateau of long partnership. It feels for a very long time like something to be proud of. I was 40 when I understood that what I had been calling dignity was actually disappearance. The understanding came slowly, and then all at once, the way certain understandings do. It came in the form of a man named Eli. Part 2, how it begins. Eli Marsh was 28 years old when he came to replace the fence along the back of our property in early May. He had been referred by our neighbours, the Callahans, who had used him for a deck project the previous summer, and spoken highly of him, reliable, skilled, showed up when he said he would, which is rarer than it should be in a small town, where contractors exist in an ecosystem of chronic lateness and unreturned phone calls. He drove a blue pickup truck that was old enough to have character, but well maintained enough to suggest competence. He arrived at 8:15 on a Monday morning, which was exactly when he had said he would arrive. I noticed the punctuality first. I noticed things like that. I am a person who makes lists and keeps schedules and operates inside a calendar that accounts for every hour of every weekday, because that is what running a household and a freelance career simultaneously requires. Daniel was already at his office in Burlington by 7:30. Cora and Owen were at school. The house was mine, which meant it was also most mornings. The place where I existed in a particular quality of solitude that had nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with feeling unseen. I brought Eli a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock, because that is what you do when someone is working on your property, and it is cold outside, and you were raised in a family where hospitality was not optional. He thanked me without excessive effusion, a simple, genuine thank you that felt more respectful than the performative gratitude people sometimes produce when they are aware of being observed for their reactions. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the fence specifications. I answered them. He went back to work. That was the entirety of our first interaction. I went inside, sat at my desk, opened the grant proposal I had been writing for a literacy non-profit in Burlington, and did not think about Eli Marsh for the rest of the day, or so I told myself. What I actually did 3 times in the following 4 hours was glance out the kitchen window at the backyard. Not for any reason I could have articulated. Just to check the progress of the work I told myself. Just to make sure everything was going well. This was, I knew even at the time, a lie I was telling myself with the particular fluency of someone who has had a lot of practice telling it. He worked steadily and without drama. He did not play music loudly, or take long breaks, or make the sort of presence-announcing noises that some people produce when they want to be noticed. He simply worked methodically, competently, occasionally pausing to look at what he had done with the critical attention of someone who has standards and is checking the work against them. On the second day, he was in the backyard when Cora came home from school. I watched from the window as she walked past him without acknowledgement, the focused indifference of a 14-year-old for whom adults who are not immediately relevant are invisible. Eli looked up and said something I could not hear it through the glass. Cora paused, looked at him with the evaluating expression she reserved for things that had surprised her, said something back and then went inside. When she came into the kitchen, I asked what he had said. He asked if the maple tree in the back was the one I was reading under last week, she said. He said he'd noticed it when he was measuring the fence line and thought it looked like a good reading spot. She opened the refrigerator. He was right. It is. She took an apple and went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after she left. Something small had shifted in the room, or perhaps only in me. A man who had been in our backyard for 2 days had noticed my daughter reading under the maple tree, had filed it away, had thought to mention it in a way that made her feel seen rather than surveyed. Daniel had not noticed she was reading under the maple tree. I was not certain Daniel had been in the backyard in the past month. I told myself this was an unfair comparison. It was. I also understood in the way that you understand things you are not ready to fully examine that unfair comparisons are sometimes the most revealing kind. Part 3. The language of small things. The fence took 3 weeks. I know how that sounds. A fence that takes 3 weeks suggests either an unusually large property or unusual circumstances, and ours was neither. The fence was not small, but it was not so large that 3 weeks was strictly necessary. What extended it, I understood later, was that Eli was thorough in a way that generated additional work. He noticed the rotting post on the east side of the property that we had not mentioned because we had not known it was rotting, and he repaired it without being asked. He noticed the gate that had been hanging incorrectly for 2 years and adjusted it. He discovered that the original fence had been installed slightly off the property line and corrected the error. Each additional task required a conversation. Each conversation began with a practical matter and occasionally went somewhere else. He asked me once, handing me a scrap of paper with a measurement on it, what I did for work. I told him grant writing nonprofits, mostly education and arts organizations. He was quiet for a moment and then said that his younger sister had gotten through college on arts grants, and he had always thought the people who wrote them were doing important work, that most people didn't understand was important. It was a specific, thoughtful thing to say. Not a compliment exactly, an acknowledgement of something real. I said more than I intended to in response. I talked about the particular challenge of making the case for arts funding to people who had been trained by the culture to think of arts as a luxury rather than a necessity. I talked about a proposal I was currently struggling with for a music program in a rural school district that was fighting a board decision to cut fine arts. I talked for perhaps 5 minutes, which is a long time to talk to someone who came to fix your fence. And he listened with the quality of attention that is rare enough that you notice it when it appears. What's the argument that actually works? He asked when I had finished. The data on academic performance, I said. The fact that students in arts programs show higher engagement across all subjects. The correlation with reduced dropout rates. I paused. But that's not actually why it matters. What's actually why it matters? I looked at him. Because a child who has never been taught that they can make something beautiful, that their particular way of seeing the world has value, grows up to be an adult who has no language for their own interior life. And that is a kind of poverty that doesn't show up in any economic metric, but costs everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then use that, he said. Not the data. That. I went inside and sat at my desk and wrote the opening paragraph of the proposal in 20 minutes. It was the best opening paragraph I had written in 2 years, and it had emerged from a conversation with a man who was there to fix my fence. I did not examine what that meant. Not yet. Part 4. What Daniel did not ask. That evening at dinner, I told Daniel about the grant proposal, about the music program, and the rural school district, and the opening paragraph I had finally found. He was looking at his phone when I began. He set it face down on the table, a gesture I recognized as the one he made when he was making an effort, and listened for the duration of what I said, which was perhaps 90 seconds. Then he said, "Sounds like you figured it out." He picked his phone back up. I sat across from him and thought about Eli saying use that. Not the data. That. I thought about the quality of attention in his face when I was speaking. Not performance, not obligation, just genuine interest in what I was saying, because what I was saying was genuinely interesting to him. I want to be fair to Daniel, because fairness matters when you are telling a story like this. and the impulse is to make the absent spouse into a villain, so that what came next feels justified. Daniel was not a villain. He was tired. He worked 60 hours a week, managing a team of software engineers for a company whose growth had outpaced its infrastructure in ways that made his job a sustained crisis for the past 2 years. He came home depleted and sat in his chair and moved through the evenings with the mechanical competence of someone operating on minimal reserves. He was not cruel. He was not there. But I want to tell you something about the Daniel I had married, because that man existed and deserves to exist in this account, alongside the man who set his phone down and picked it back up. The Daniel I had married at 29 was a man who stayed up until 3 in the morning talking, who planned a surprise trip to Quebec for my 30th birthday that involved a handwritten list of every restaurant I had mentioned wanting to go to in the previous year, assembled from paying attention for 12 months without my knowing he was keeping track, who showed up at my mother's house the day she was diagnosed with cancer without being asked and stayed for 4 days, sleeping on an air mattress in the spare room, because he understood that what I needed was not to be told it would be okay, but to not be alone while I was afraid. Who once, early in our marriage, spent an entire Sunday afternoon walking with me through an art museum. Neither of us had a strong feeling about asking questions about every painting, because he wanted to understand how I saw things, what the way I saw them said about who I was. That man had not gone somewhere else. He had gone somewhere inward, into the exhaustion of an overextended professional life, and the assumption, which had calcified over years, that a marriage which was not in active crisis did not require active maintenance. He had made the error that I suspect most marriages make at some point in their middle years. He had confused the absence of disaster with the presence of connection. The problem with a spouse who is not cruel is that you cannot leave without feeling like you are making a choice that cannot be defended. The problem with a spouse who is not there is that you cannot point to what is wrong, because what is wrong is an absence. An absence is very difficult to prosecute. What I felt sitting across from Daniel at the dinner table that night was something I had been feeling for years and had not allowed myself to name, until a man in my backyard had asked me a question and waited for the full answer. I was invisible. Not to everyone, to the person who was supposed to see me most clearly. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to Daniel's breathing deepen into sleep, and I thought about the difference between being known and being familiar. Daniel was familiar with me. He knew my coffee order and my shoe size and the way I held my shoulders when I was stressed and the name of the non-profit I had worked for before I started freelancing. He knew the inventory of me, the facts and the habits and the predictable responses. He did not know what I was thinking. He had stopped asking. When had he stopped asking? I thought about it for a long time in the dark, trying to locate the moment, the specific inflection point where asking had shifted from habit to exception and then from exception to absence. I could not find it. The not finding told me something important. It had not been a moment. It had been a direction, a gradual reorientation, so incremental that neither of us had registered the change until the distance between where we had started and where we had arrived was too large to bridge without noticing the crossing. I fell asleep eventually. I dreamed about nothing I could remember. But I woke at 3 in the morning with the specific clarity that only comes at 3 in the morning, the clarity that burns off by 6, but is absolutely true while it lasts. And what it told me was this: I was not looking for a different life. I was looking for my own life, the interior version of it, the one I had stopped offering, because the person I most wanted to offer it to had stopped seeming to want it. And I had begun offering it somewhere else, because the alternative had seemed to be not offering it at all. That was the truth I had been turning away from. It was much smaller and much larger than I had wanted it to be. Part 5, the accumulation. The fence was finished in the 3rd week of May. Eli came to collect the final payment on a Friday afternoon, and I wrote him a check at the kitchen counter and thanked him for the work, which had been excellent. The gate hung correctly for the first time in 2 years. The rotting post had been replaced. The line was straight. He said, "Thank you," folded the check and turned to leave. At the door he stopped. Not with drama, just paused the way people pause when they have thought of something. "The grant proposal," he said. "How did it go on?" "I had submitted it 2 days earlier." "I don't know yet. They won't respond for 6 weeks." He nodded. "I hope it works," he said. "The kids should have the music program." Then he left. I stood at the kitchen door and watched his truck pull out of the driveway, and had the specific sensation of a room losing its light when someone leaves it, which is something I had not felt in longer than I could precisely remember. I did not hear from Eli for 3 weeks. I did not expect to. The fence was done, the job was complete. There was no professional reason for further contact. I went back to my regular life, the grant proposals, the school pickups, the dinners, and the book club, and the calendar that accounted for every hour. I went back to the evenings in which Daniel came home and sat in his chair, and I sat in mine, and the television was on, and we were in the same room and utterly separate. I was fine. I told myself this. I was fine. Then he called. It was a Tuesday morning. I recognized the number. I had called it 3 times during the fence project for questions about timing and materials. When I answered, his voice was slightly uncertain. The uncertainty of someone who is not sure they have the right to make a call and has made it anyway. He said he was sorry to bother me, but he was bidding on a project for a family 3 roads over, and they had mentioned our fence and asked if they could see it. He wanted to make sure that was all right with us before he brought them by. I said, "Of course." He said, "Thank you," and was about to end the call when I said, without planning to, "The proposal got funded." A pause. Then, "The music program. Full funding," I said. "They called yesterday." "That's incredible," he said. And the quality of it, not the polished congratulations of someone performing enthusiasm, but the genuine reaction of someone who had been invested in the outcome, because the outcome mattered, undid something in me that I had been keeping carefully maintained. We talked for 20 minutes. I had not intended to talk for 20 minutes. But the conversation opened the way conversations do when 2 people discover that they have more to say to each other than the context that brought them together, and neither of them moves to close it. He told me about the project he was bidding on. He told me about a class he was taking in the evening, structural engineering online, the first step toward a degree he had deferred when his mother got sick 3 years ago, and he had moved back to Vermont to help his family. I told him about the music program, about the director who had called me in tears, about the particular joy of having made a case for something that mattered and had it succeed. When I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time without opening any documents. I was not in love with Eli Marsh. I want to be clear about this, because clarity is what the story requires, even when the feelings themselves resist it. I was not in love with him. But I was in some state that had been dormant in me for long enough that I had forgotten what it felt like to be in it. The state of being genuinely interested in another person and genuinely interesting to them. The state of being asked questions and having the answers matter. The state of existing in someone else's attention as a specific person rather than a function. It is not love, but it is not nothing. And the distance between not love and not nothing is where most of the complicated decisions in a person's life are made. Part 6, the notes. He came by twice more that summer, on professional pretexts that were real, but not sufficient to fully explain the visits. Once, to look at a drainage issue along the back fence line that he had noticed when he brought the prospective clients. Once, to return a level he said he had left in the garage, though I had not noticed it there and was not entirely certain it had been there. Both times we talked. Not for long, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, the duration of a cup of coffee standing in the kitchen, or a slow walk around the perimeter of the property while he explained something about the drainage. But with the quality of attention that I had begun to understand was specific to these conversations that I could not find anywhere else in my daily life. He sent me 2 articles over the following weeks. One about arts funding and its correlation with community resilience. One about a school district in Minnesota that had expanded its music program after a decade of cuts and the data that had followed. He sent them with short messages, thought of the grant, and related to what you said about the data versus the real reason. He was not romantic in these messages. He was thoughtful in a way that felt more intimate than romance would have, because romance performs itself, but genuine attention cannot be faked. I wrote back. I should not have. I knew I should not have, and I wrote back anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence in those weeks felt like returning to a room I had been slowly suffocating in. We texted about things that were not personal and were entirely personal, about the articles, about the ongoing grants I was working on, about the structural engineering class, which he was passing with marks that surprised him, about his mother who had stabilized after her illness and was now living independently again, which he described with the specific relief of someone for whom that outcome had not been guaranteed. I told him things I had not told Daniel. Not secrets, nothing concealed. Just the particular quality of my interior life that I had stopped offering to my husband, because my husband had stopped seeming to want it, and stopping offering something that is refused enough times is an act of self-preservation. I told him about the book I was reading that had made me cry on the back porch, about the morning I had watched the fog come off the Vermont hills, and felt for the first time in a long time completely present in my own life, about the fear, unexamined, persistent, that I was becoming invisible not just in my marriage, but in myself. That the woman who had once had opinions about everything and went after things and felt the full weight of her own existence was being slowly replaced by a function, mother-wife household manager, the person who kept the calendar. He listened. He always listened with the quality of attention that I had begun to understand was not just temperament, but choice, the active decision to be present to what another person was saying, rather than waiting for your turn to speak or forming your response while they were still mid-sentence. He said things in return that were honest rather than comforting, which is a rarer gift. "You're not disappearing," he said once, when I had articulated the fear more directly than I usually allowed myself to. "You're just not being looked at. Those are different things." I sat with that for a long time. One afternoon in August, I found a folded note in the pocket of the canvas jacket I wore when I was working in the garden. I did not remember how it had gotten there. It had been there for days at least, the paper soft from being washed accidentally. It read in handwriting I did not recognize as his at first, because I had not seen his handwriting before. The grant proposal worked, because you knew what you were talking about. Don't let anyone convince you that you're only useful for the things that don't require all of you. I stood in the kitchen for a long time holding that piece of paper. Then I put it in the drawer of my desk, under the grant proposals, and the utility bills, and the calendar printouts where I did not have to decide what it meant. Part 7. The Crisis. It was Cora who found the note, not the original I had disposed of. That one eventually understanding that keeping it was the beginning of a concealment I was not prepared to engage in. But another one written later, which I had been less careful about. She found it in the kitchen during a Sunday afternoon when I had left it on the counter tucked under a coffee mug, meaning to put it away, and having been interrupted by Owen needing something. She was 14, and she read it the way 14-year-olds read things that fall into their hands, completely, immediately, without the adult hesitation that would have prompted her to leave it alone. When I came back to the kitchen, she was standing at the counter holding it. "Mum," she said. Her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Not accusatory, not frightened, but the particular careful tone of someone handling something they do not fully understand and are trying not to break. "Who wrote this?" I felt the world go very still. "It's from someone who did some work on the house," I said. My voice was level. I was grateful for the levelness even as I was horrified by the ease of it. It was a note about a project. She looked at the note again, read it again, then looked at me. "It doesn't sound like a project note," she said. "Give it to me, please." She handed it over. She did not argue, which was somehow more disturbing than argument would have been. She went upstairs. For the next hour, the house was very quiet. That night, after both children were in bed, I sat in the kitchen and looked at the note and understood with the clarity that comes at certain moments when you have been trying not to see something and finally stop trying that I had crossed a line I had not acknowledged I was approaching. Not a physical line, nothing had happened between Eli and me that I could not have described to Daniel without shame. But a line of emotional intimacy, a line of chosen attention, a line of preference. I had been choosing Eli's company over Daniel's, had been bringing the best of my interior life to Eli, and the routine management of it to Daniel, and had been telling myself this was innocent because nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. And something had happened. Both were true. The something that had happened was not an act, but an orientation. The slow, deliberate turning of my attention towards someone who was not my husband. The slow, deliberate allowing of his attention to become necessary to me. I had not told Daniel about Eli. I had described the fence project, the drainage issue, the visits. I had not described the phone call about the grant, the articles, the 20-minute conversations about things that mattered. I had not described the note. The omissions were not innocent. I had known that for months and had continued anyway. Part 8. What Daniel knew. 3 days after Cora found the note, Daniel came home at 6 o'clock instead of 8:30. He was not often home at 6. I was making dinner when I heard the back door and turned surprised to find him in the kitchen with his work bag still over his shoulder, not yet set down. He had the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and has decided it is time to stop thinking and start speaking. "Who is Eli Marsh?" he said. My hands stopped moving. I set the wooden spoon down on the counter with a deliberateness that I hoped looked like calm and was not. He did the fence in May, I said, and a few repairs. Cora said something to me, Daniel said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The room was very quiet. The clock above the refrigerator, the one that had needed a new battery for 3 weeks, and I had not replaced, ticked with its slightly arrhythmic pace. Outside the window, the October Vermont light was doing its particular thing with the maple trees, making everything look like it was both ending and impossibly beautiful. "Tell me what happened," he said. His voice was not raised. It was not cold exactly. It was the voice of someone who is working very hard to remain in the mode of wanting to understand rather than wanting to damage something. I told him. Not everything at once, it came in the way truths come when you have been holding them for a long time, unevenly, the most defensible parts, first and the most difficult parts, requiring more effort to name. I told him about the conversations, about the note, about the way I had started bringing the parts of my interior life that I had stopped offering him to someone else instead, and about how I had allowed that to happen without examining what it meant. I did not use the word affair because it was not an affair by any conventional definition. I used other words, connection, attention, intimacy, that were more accurate, and I saw in Daniel's face more damaging than affair might have been, because they described something that could not be straightforwardly repudiated. He stood in the kitchen while I talked, and he did not interrupt. And when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The clock ticked. The light outside changed as the sun finished setting. "Did you want to leave?" he asked finally. "No," I said. And then, because honesty had become the only available mode, I didn't want to leave. I wanted to be seen. Those turned out to be available from different directions. He sat down. Not heavily carefully the way you sit down when your legs have decided the conversation requires it. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at his hands. "I stopped asking," he said, not a question. "Yes?" I stopped. He paused, looked for words. "I stopped asking and you stopped offering, and I told myself we had arrived somewhere mature and you were telling yourself you were disappearing." He looked up. "That's what happened." "Yes," I said. "That's what happened." He was quiet again for a long time. "And now?" I sat down across from him. We were at the kitchen table where we had eaten dinner 1,000 times, where Cora had done homework, and Owen had built elaborate structures out of Legos, and we had argued about money and disciplinary decisions and forgotten anniversaries, where we had also in earlier years talked for hours about nothing in particular, because talking to each other had been something we chose rather than something we scheduled. "I don't know what now looks like," I said, "but I know that I need to tell you this, and I know that not telling you was the part I can't undo." "And him, I'm going to stop," I said. "The contact. I should have stopped it months ago." I looked at him. "I'm telling you that because it's what I owe you, not because I want credit for it." Daniel looked at his hands again. "I need some time," he said, "to think about this." "I know." He got up and left the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs. I sat at the table alone for a very long time, and the October light finished its change into dark, and the clock ticked its arrhythmic tick, and I sat with the full weight of what I had done and what I had not done, and the specific terrible clarity of having finally stopped lying to myself. Part 9. The Reckoning. The following 2 weeks were the hardest of my marriage. Not because Daniel raged. He did not rage. Not because the children were drawn into it. We were both careful in the way that parents are careful when they understand that their children's security depends on the management of adult disasters. We were careful with each other too, with the specific terrible carefulness of two people navigating the same space after one of them has done something that cannot be undone. He slept in the guest room. He told me this matter-of-factly on the first evening as if announcing a practical decision. And I did not argue because it was a practical decision. An argument would have been both futile and unfair. I lay in our bed at night and listened to the house the way I had listened to it for years. The heating system, the occasional creak of the floors, Owen turning over in his sleep in the room next door. And I felt the specific shape of Daniel's absence in the room with a precision that surprised me. He had not been present, and now his not being present had become a different kind of weight. The weight was heavier than I had expected. I had been carrying the weight of his gradual absence for years without fully naming it, and now I understood what it had cost me by experiencing a version of it that was deliberate rather than inadvertent. He had withdrawn into the guest room by choice. That choice was earned. I had given him every reason to make it, and its consequence was that I understood from the inside what I had been asking him to live with every time I had been in the same room and been somewhere else. I texted Eli. I had not done this. I had intended to call. I thought a call was more honest, less easily misread. But when the moment came, the distance of a text felt like the only manageable option. I said, I need to stop contact. I've told my husband about the conversations and the notes. I'm sorry if this is abrupt. I wish you well genuinely. His response came an hour later. I understand. I'm sorry if I contributed to something painful. I hope things work out for your family. I read it twice. Then I deleted the conversation from my phone. What I felt was not relief exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that contained both the specific mixture of loss and rightness that comes when you choose correctly after choosing incorrectly for too long. The loss was real. I do not want to minimize it, because minimizing it would be dishonest, and dishonesty is how I had arrived at this moment. What Eli had offered me was real. The attention was real. The conversations were real. The way his presence in my life had illuminated something about the shape of my loneliness was real. None of that ceased to be true when I deleted the conversation from my phone. What also became real in the days that followed was the scope of what I had done. Not the content of it. I had understood the content since the moment Cora held up the note. What became real was the duration. 8 months of gradual intimacy. 8 months of chosen attention. 8 months of carrying a version of my interior life that I was hiding from my husband while offering it to someone else. 8 months of small decisions that I had made one at a time, each one manageable, seeming in isolation, that had accumulated into something I would not have predicted or chosen in a single moment. This is the part that required the most honesty. The fact that no single step had felt definitive made it easier to take the next one. That is how these things work. Not with a decision, but with a series of non-decisions. The failure to stop repeated often enough, that becomes the same thing as a choice. I started therapy again. Not the maintenance sessions of 3 years ago, but actual work with a therapist named Ruth, who asked hard questions and did not accept careful answers. In the first session, she asked me to describe what I had been looking for in the conversations with Eli that I had not found at home. I resisted the question. Initially, it felt like self-justification, and then answered it as honestly as I could. To be asked, I said. To be heard. To be interesting to someone rather than useful to them. Ruth looked at me steadily. And have you ever told Daniel that that was what you needed? I started to say yes and stopped. When, she asked? I could not answer. The answer, when I found it honestly in the days after the session, was not for years. I had expected Daniel to know what I needed. Without being told, had resented him for not knowing, had sought it elsewhere, when the resentment became unbearable, and had never clearly, specifically in words, that left no room for misinterpretation, told him what I was looking for and could not find. This was not a defense of what I had done. The omission did not justify the alternative I had chosen. But it was the part of the story that was mine to own, and Ruth was right that I had not been owning it. There was also something else Ruth asked in the third session that I had not been ready to hear in the first two. She asked, what did I think the 8 months with Eli had cost Daniel? I started to answer in the way I had been answering, focusing on the betrayal of trust, the concealment, the emotional intimacy I had redirected. Ruth stopped me. Not what it cost him in the abstract, she said. What do you think it cost him specifically as a person who had already spent years feeling like he was failing at something he couldn't identify on? I sat with that for a long time. Daniel had been working 60 hours a week, coming home to a wife who was increasingly self-sufficient and increasingly remote, telling himself that the self-sufficiency meant she was fine, that the remoteness was something marriages settled into, that the way she didn't seem to need him was something to be respected rather than mourned. He had been performing the function of husband and father with the competence that was his native mode, and the growing unexamined sensation that the performance was not reaching anyone. And during 8 months of that, the woman he had chosen had been being seen, really seen by someone else. Had been offering to someone else the interior life that she had stopped offering him. Had been, in the most fundamental sense, elsewhere. What that had cost him was not just trust. It was the confirmation of the fear he had been carrying without naming, that he had already lost her somewhere in the middle years and had not known it was happening. I brought this to Daniel on a Saturday afternoon when the children were both out of the house, Cora, at a friend's, Owen, at soccer. We sat in the kitchen, which had become the room where the difficult conversations happened, because it was where we had always had them, even before we understood what difficulty meant. I never told you, I said, what I needed. I expected you to know, and when you didn't, I decided you didn't care, and I was wrong about that. About the decision, I mean. I may have been right that you didn't know. I was wrong that the way to respond to that was to find it somewhere else, rather than telling you. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't know you were lonely, he said. I know. I knew I was working too much. I thought you'd... He paused. I thought you'd tell me if something was wrong. I thought the same thing about you, I said, that you'd ask. We sat in the familiar, devastating silence of two people who have identified the same failure from two different directions. I don't know how to fix this, Daniel said. I want to. I need you to know that. But I don't know what fixing it looks like. Neither do I said. But I think it starts with telling the truth about what we each stopped doing. He looked at me. I stopped asking, he said. That's what I stopped doing. And I stopped saying, I said. Those are different failures with the same result. He looked at the table. Do you love him? His voice was level, and I understood that the levelness was costing him. No, I said immediately. I needed what he offered. That is not the same as loving him? But you felt something. Yes, I said. I felt seen. That's what I felt. And I followed that feeling further than I should have, because I had convinced myself it wasn't available here. Is it available here? He said. Is it something I can give you the seeing? I looked at him across the kitchen table. The man who had planned the Quebec trip, who had stayed 4 days at my mother's house, who had spent an entire Sunday afternoon asking questions about painting so he could understand how I saw things. Yes, I said. But you have to decide to do it, not once, all the time. I know, he said. I'm deciding. Part 10, what Daniel said next. He asked to see the couple's therapist together. Not Ruth, a different one, someone who was neither of ours neutral ground. Her name was Dr. Sarah Okafor, and she had an office in Burlington that smelled of cedar and old paper, and conducted sessions with the unhurried patience of someone who had seen many versions of this particular kind of crisis, and understood that the work of it could not be rushed. The first session was the hardest thing I had done in years. Not because of anything Dr. Okafor asked. Her questions were careful and not unkind, but because of what Daniel said in response to them. He talked about the working hours, about the way the job had consumed him, about the specific texture of exhaustion that had made connection feel like one more demand on a system that had nothing left to give. He talked about noticing somewhere in the middle years of the marriage that Anna seemed to have stopped needing him, seemed to have become so capable, so self-sufficient, so competent in the management of everything, that he had told himself his contribution was the income and the structural presence and the steady reliability of someone who showed up. I made myself a function too, he said. He looked at me when he said it, not at Dr. Okafor. I thought that was what you needed, what we had both agreed to. I didn't realize. He stopped. That the agreement was wrong, I said. That the agreement had never actually been made, he said. That we had both just started performing it. Dr. Okafor wrote something in her notebook. Outside her window, Burlington was doing its early November things. Grey sky, bare trees. The quality of light that is less bleak than honest. We went to 3 sessions before I felt the quality of the conversations change, not resolve, but open the way a window opens when you finally push it, instead of only looking at the frame. The sessions required us to do something we had both stopped doing, ask each other things. Not the logistical questions of shared household management, but the actual questions. What are you afraid of? What do you need that you're not getting? What version of this marriage do you want? Not the one we have, but the one we want. The answers were not always comfortable. Daniel was afraid, he said, of being seen as insufficient, of being someone who needed things rather than someone who provided them, because providing had been the language of love in his family of origin, and he had never fully unlearned it. He needed acknowledgement that his work, the invisible structural work of earning and showing up, was a form of care even when it looked like absence. I needed to be asked. Specifically, directly, repeatedly, not once in a while when it was convenient, but as a regular practice, the daily or weekly check-in that said, "You are interesting to me. What is happening in your interior life? I want to know." I needed to stop being efficient at myself and start being visible in my own marriage. These are not complicated needs in retrospect. They are the most ordinary needs 2 people can have. The complication was that we had both stopped expressing them and started assuming the other person either knew or didn't care. And the assuming had slowly replaced the actual relationship with a simulation of it. Part 11, Cora. My daughter did not ask me directly what was happening between her father and me. She was 14, old enough to understand that something was different, not old enough or willing enough to want the full truth of it. She navigated the changed atmosphere of the house, the way adolescents navigate adult difficulties, by making herself slightly smaller in the shared spaces, by spending more time in her room, by being watchful in a way that was barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. I was looking for it because Cora had been the one who found the note, and whatever she had made of it had been sitting inside her for weeks, and I owed her something. On a Thursday evening, I knocked on her door. She was at her desk, doing homework, the particular focused posture she adopted when she was working on something difficult. She looked up. I sat on the edge of her bed. "Can I talk to you for a few minutes?" She put her pencil down. "Okay." I thought about what to say. I had thought about it for days, trying to find the version that was honest, without being a burden, that acknowledged what she had witnessed, without converting her into a participant in adult crisis. "I want to say something about the note you found," I said. She was very still. "Your father and I are going through something hard," I said. "We're working on it together with help. I'm not going to tell you the details because they're not yours to carry. But I want you to know 2 things. I looked at her. "First, you did the right thing showing it to me instead of pretending you hadn't seen it. Second, whatever is difficult between your father and me is between your father and me. It doesn't have anything to do with how much we love you, and it doesn't mean our family is ending." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you sure about that? The family not ending part, eh?" "Yes," I said. And I meant it with a completeness that surprised me, because I had not been certain of it 3 weeks ago, and I was certain of it now, which told me something about what those 3 weeks of work had done. She nodded. She picked up her pencil. Then she set it down again. "Mum," she said, "you seem different lately. Not bad different, just more like yourself." I sat with that for a moment. "I'm trying to be," I said. Part 12, The Long Way Back. The work of repairing something that has been damaged by gradual neglect, and a specific act of betrayal, because that is what it was, even without a physical dimension. Even with the mitigating context of years of mutual disappearance, is slow and not linear, and contains more reversal than anyone who has not done it would anticipate. There were evenings when Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table and talked with the careful, effortful quality of people who are learning a new language together, stumbling over syntax, losing the thread, having to start over. There were other evenings when the conversation moved with a naturalness that felt like the early years of the marriage, when we had stayed up until 2 a.m. because we had too much to say to each other, to sleep. There were also the hard evenings which I want to describe honestly, because the hard evenings are the part that stories about repair tend to abbreviate. The evenings when Daniel would be sitting across from me at dinner, and something would shift in his expression, some internal current, that I was only learning to read, and I would know that he was thinking about Eli. Not because the name came up, not because anything was said, but because the quality of his attention changed, and I understood what the change meant. On those evenings, neither of us knew exactly what to do. He was not trying to punish me with the silence. I was not performing patience to manage it. We were both inside something genuine and unresolved, and we had agreed in therapy with Dr. Okafor present to make the agreement real, that the way to handle those moments was not to manage them, but to name them. "You're thinking about it, I would say." "Yes." "Do you want to talk about it, or do you need it to sit for a while?" Sometimes he needed it to sit. Sometimes he needed to talk. Knowing which was possible, only because we had started asking instead of assuming which was the single most important change we had made, and the one that required the most sustained effort to maintain. He asked me once in the 3rd month whether I had feelings for Eli that I hadn't told him about. We were in the kitchen, which is where we always were for the difficult ones. I thought about the question carefully before answering, because the temptation was to give the reassuring answer, no, nothing. It was nothing, and the reassuring answer was not entirely the true one. I had feelings, I said. I don't think they were love. I think they were the feeling of being seen, which had become so rare that I had confused it with something larger. I looked at him. I'm telling you this because you asked, and because I said we would do honesty completely, not selectively. He was quiet for a moment. Then, were they real? The feelings, yes. Were they about him specifically? No, I said. That's what took me a long time to understand. They were about me. About the part of me that had gone underground. He was the person who happened to illuminate that part, but the part was always mine. The loneliness was mine. The need was mine. I paused. He was a mirror, not a destination. Daniel sat with that. I want to be the mirror, he said, going forward. You are, I said. You're learning to be. That's what this is. There was a night in December, 4 months after the kitchen conversation, when Daniel came home from work at 6, which had become his new consistent time, a deliberate restructuring of priorities that he had made without fanfare, and found me sitting on the back porch in the cold, wrapped in my winter coat, looking at the fence. He came outside without asking. He sat beside me. He looked at the fence for a moment. Does it bother you? He said, looking at it. A little, I said, less than it did. He nodded. I've been thinking about something Ruth said. I told him. About why it happened. About what I was looking for. Tell me, he said. I turned and looked at him. He was looking at me directly, with the quality of attention that I had found elsewhere, because I had stopped believing I could find it here. He was looking at me, as if what I was about to say mattered to him. I needed to be asked, I said. That was most of it. I needed someone to look at me and want to know what was happening in my interior life. Not because they were obligated to, because they were interested. Ask you now, he said. I'm asking now. I looked at him for a moment. Then I started talking. I talked about the grant I was currently working on, about a passage in the book I had been reading that had made me stop and sit with it for an hour, about the fear I still carried, smaller now, but present, that I could disappear inside a life that was full of things and empty of witness. About the hope, which had been growing slowly but steadily, in the months since the kitchen conversation, that 2 people who had gradually replaced the actual relationship with a performance of it could learn to reverse that process. About the October light on the maple trees, which was the most beautiful thing I had seen all year, and about Cora's comment that I seemed more like myself, which had settled into me and stayed. Daniel listened. He asked questions. He said things in return that were his own, his fears, his interior life, the parts of himself he had also been keeping in private rooms that he had been slowly opening over the course of 4 months of hard work. We sat on the back porch until we were both cold enough to need to go inside. When we stood up, he reached for my hand and I took it. We walked back through the garden past the fence he had seen me look at into the house where our children were sleeping, and the clock above the refrigerator still needed a new battery that I would remember to replace tomorrow. That night, I lay in our bed again, and listened to the familiar sounds of the house. and felt something I had not felt in longer than I could precisely date the specific quality of being in the right place. Not because the right place was perfect. It was not. It was a place that had been damaged and was being repaired. And repair is not the same as never having been broken. And never having been broken is not actually what most long marriages are. Most long marriages are things that have been broken and repaired so many times that the repairs become part of the structure, part of what holds the whole thing up. I had done something wrong. I owned that with a completeness that had taken months to arrive at. Not the frantic self-flagellation of the first weeks, but the steady, clear-eyed accounting that is the only kind that actually changes behavior. I had let my own loneliness become an argument for a choice that was not mine to make without acknowledging it to the person it most affected. I had sought in someone else's attention what I should have insisted on finding, or finding a way to build at home. And Daniel had done something too. Not the same thing, different things, quieter things. The slow abandonment of curiosity that happens when people mistake familiarity for closeness and stop doing the work that keeps a relationship alive. He owned that too, with the same clear-eyed accounting, because that was the agreement we had made, the full picture, not the convenient one. Part 13. What I know now. It has been a year, not a triumphant year. I want to be honest about that. Because the version of this story that ends with triumphant year is the version that leaves people feeling cheated when their own repair turns out to be messier and slower. It has been a year that contained genuine progress and genuine setbacks, and occasional evenings where we sat in the same room and were in completely different places, and occasions where the fact of what happened sat in the room between us and had to be acknowledged rather than managed. It has also been a year that contained the grant I won for a mentorship program for first-generation college students, which I wrote in 3 days, on a kind of momentum that I had not felt in years. The year that Cora made the varsity soccer team at 15, which she was quietly extraordinary about, accepting the accomplishment with the specific composure of someone who had worked hard for something and was not surprised to have achieved it. The year that Owen decided he wanted to learn the violin, which he is terrible at in the way that people at the beginning of something are terrible at it, with complete dedication to being terrible, certain that if you put in enough hours, the terrible becomes something else. The year that Daniel started coming home at 6, that he started asking. Not every day we are not the people who have transformed into perfect communicators, who never slide back into the mutual efficiency of two people too busy for each other. But often enough, with the consistency of someone who has decided this is a practice rather than an event, who has understood that the work of being present to someone is ongoing and not accomplishable once and filed away. I think about Eli sometimes. Not in the way I thought about him during the summer. That particular quality of need has resolved into something more neutral, an understanding of what he represented, without the charge that the representation once carried. I think about him with gratitude, which is the complicated emotion to name. Because gratitude seems like an odd thing to feel toward a person whose presence in your life precipitated a crisis. But the crisis was necessary. The crisis was the moment the invisible thing became visible enough to be addressed. What he offered me was not love. It was not a relationship. It was a mirror, the specific function of showing me by contrast what I had stopped believing was possible inside the life I was already living. That was his function, even if he did not know it, even if the offering was unintentional. And the crisis that followed was what forced me to stop looking in the mirror and start doing something about what I had seen. I am not invisible anymore. Not because someone else sees me, though. Daniel is learning too, and the learning is real, and the evidence of it is accumulating. But because I have stopped allowing invisibility, I have stopped translating my own interior life into the language of usefulness and efficiency, and begun insisting with the patience that hard things require, that it exists in its actual language, the language of desire and fear and curiosity and ambition and love that is not performed but felt. I am still the woman who manages the household and keeps track of the birthdays and the doctor's appointments and the grant deadlines and the zucchini that keeps growing. I am also the woman who sits on the back porch in the October light and watches the maple trees and thinks about things that have nothing to do with the calendar. Both of those women are the same woman. I had forgotten that for a while. I remember it now. One evening last week, Daniel came home to find me on the porch with a glass of wine and the book I had been trying to finish for a month. He poured himself a glass and sat beside me without asking if I wanted company, because he has learned that I always want his company and will not always volunteer that I want it. And asking has become something he does rather than something I wait for. He sat beside me and asked what I was reading. I told him. He asked what it was about. I told him that too. Not the plot summary, but the actual thing. The question the book was sitting inside. The reason it was taking me a long time to finish it. Because I kept having to stop and think about what it had just said. He listened. When I finished, he said, "That sounds like you." "Which part?" "The stopping to think," he said. "You've always done that. Stop to really think about things." I forgot how much I love that about you. I looked at him. He was looking at me. "When did you forget?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "A long time ago." He picked up his glass. "I'm trying to remember." We sat on the porch until the light was completely gone from the maple trees, until the Vermont October dark had settled completely over the garden and the fence and the house where our children were doing their evening things. We sat side by side in the dark and talked about nothing important and everything that was, and the clock inside above the refrigerator was ticking finally. At the right pace again. Epilogue: what I want to tell you. If you are reading this because some part of it is true for you, because you have felt the particular loneliness of being inside a life that looks correct from the outside and feels like disappearance from the inside, I want to say something that someone said to me once in a different context that I have not stopped thinking about. You are not disappearing. You are just not being looked at. Those are different things. And the difference matters because disappearing cannot be reversed. But not being looked at is a condition that has causes and therefore has remedies. The first remedy is the hardest you have to say it. Not hint at it, not perform it, not wait for someone to notice it and ask. You have to use your actual words to describe your actual need to the actual person who matters. This is terrifying because it is the most exposed version of asking the one that leaves no ambiguity about what you wanted if you don't receive it. But the ambiguous asking, the hint, the withdrawal, the reaching across the bed at night and telling yourself that if they were paying attention, they would know you were reaching the ambiguous. Asking protects you from the clarity of rejection while guaranteeing the certainty of loneliness. It is the protection that costs everything. The second remedy is slower. You have to decide again every day to be present to the person you chose, not the person you remember choosing, not the person you expected them to become, not the function they perform in the architecture of your shared life. The actual person with the interior life that is still happening even when you are too tired to ask about it. with the fears and ambitions and observations that they have stopped offering because you stopped seeming to want them. Daniel does this now, not perfectly. We are not a story with perfect endings, only honest ones. He forgets sometimes. On the evenings he forgets, I remind him. And the reminding is easier than it once was, because we have both agreed that it is not criticism, but maintenance, the routine attention that keeps something alive. And on the evenings he asks without forgetting, without being reminded, with the quality of genuine curiosity that I had stopped believing was available on those evenings, which are more frequent than they were a year ago, and less frequent than I hope they will be in another year. I feel something that I had spent a long time looking for in the wrong direction. I feel found. The remedy is harder than the crisis. The crisis has an urgency to it, a momentum that carries you through the most difficult part on its own terrible energy. The repair is quiet work, incremental work that has to be chosen again every day rather than accomplished once. It requires two people who are both willing to do the choosing, and that is the part that cannot be controlled or forced. You can only do your part of the choosing and trust that the other person will do theirs. Daniel did his, I did mine. We are still doing it. I suspect we will be doing it for a long time, which is not the ending I would have written for this story if I were writing it from the outside, but which is from the inside exactly what a living marriage feels like. Not a destination, not a problem solved, a practice. A daily, imperfect, completely necessary practice of choosing to look and choosing to be seen, and refusing, despite the exhaustion and the habit and the accumulated weight of years, to let the other person become invisible. That is what I know now. That is the whole of it. One last thing. The music program got fully funded. I learned this on a Thursday morning in November, a year after the fence. A year after Eli, a year after the kitchen conversation, where Daniel and I finally said the true things to each other. The school district director called me personally to say that the board had approved the expanded program, that the first cohort of students had already started, that a girl in the 7th grade had apparently discovered she could play the cello in a way that made her teacher stop mid-sentence and listen. I sat at my desk after the call and thought about what I had said to Eli that afternoon in the backyard, about the argument that actually works, that a child who has never been taught that their particular way of seeing the world has value grows up to be an adult who has no language for their own interior life. I had been that adult. I had spent years without the language. I was learning it back one careful word at a time, in the kitchen and the therapist's office, and on the back porch, in the October dark, and in the conversations I was finally having with the man I had chosen, and was choosing again every day with the full understanding of what the choosing required. The language is not easy. It is also not optional, and it is, I have learned, always worth the difficulty of finding it. The end. Cast of characters: Anna Hartley, 41 years old, grant writer for non-profits. Ashford, Vermont. A woman who had been so capable and so efficient at her own life that she had slowly become invisible within it. Who sought in someone else's attention what she had stopped believing was available at home. Who chose finally, and at significant cost, the harder and more honest path. Daniel Hartley, 43 years old, software engineering manager, Burlington. A man who had translated love into provision so completely and for so long that he had forgotten that presence is a separate and equally necessary act. Who learned at the cost of a crisis to ask the question he had stopped asking. Eli Marsh, 28 years old, Contractor Ashford, a young man who noticed things a daughter reading under a maple tree, a woman who had something important to say about arts funding and why it mattered, who offered attention without fully understanding what attention meant to the person receiving it, who ended things with the dignity of someone who understood what was right, even when right was not what he wanted. Cora Hartley, 14 years old, the daughter who found the note, who was old enough to understand that something had shifted, and young enough to not need the full explanation, who told her mother she seemed more like herself, which turned out to be the truest thing said in a difficult year. Owen Hartley, 10 years old, dedicated to the violin despite clear evidence that dedication and aptitude are not the same thing. Unaffected by the adult difficulties around him in the specific way of a child whose parents have worked very hard to protect him from them. Dr. Ruth Anna's individual therapist, asked hard questions and did not accept careful answers. The most useful kind of professional, Dr. Sarah Okafor, couples therapist, Burlington. Unhurried, precise, skilled at asking the question that required two people to look at each other rather than at her.